The Southern San Andreas Fault Evaluation Project, which we call SoSAFE, is a special project of the Southern California Earthquake Center that has been funded by the USGS Multi-Hazards Demonstration Project during its first 3 years.
SoSAFE, the Southern San Andreas Fault Evaluation, is a project to understand the history of earthquakes on the Southern San Andreas Fault to enable us to do a better job of assessing the future risk.
The San Andreas Fault forms a portion of the Pacific Ring of Fire, a name that describes the vast horseshoe-shaped zone of intense volcanism and earthquakes. The Ring of Fire extends around the margins of the Pacific Ocean and coincide with some of the most densely populated regions on Earth. Along the San Andreas Fault, the Pacific Plate moves northwest with respect to the North American Plate about 35 millimeters per year. This steady motion loads the fault, and when the stresses are released, large earthquakes occur. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, a magnitude 7.8, devastated the city with a combination of shaking damage and the fires that followed. Subsequent studies show that the San Andreas Fault was to blame, and that it continues the length of the state of California for roughly 1,300 kilometers, about 800 miles. SoSAFE began in 2007 to mark the 150th anniversary of the last big one on the Southern San Andreas Fault. The 1857 Fort Tejon earthquake occurred at a time when Los Angeles was home to only a few thousand people, and the adobe buildings were at most 3 stories tall.
SoSAFE has really allowed us to delve into the rupture history of the San Andreas and the San Jacinto faults, which are the 2 most dangerous faults in Southern California. And we really need a longer view. In other words, we really want to get about a 2,000-year record of earthquakes, because we know there have been periods in the past when seismic production has been suppressed, and other periods we've had clusters of earthquakes.
The 1857 earthquake began with the foreshock sequence near Parkfield, which is now home of the Parkfield Prediction Experiment. It ruptured for about 360 kilometers to the southeast, ending at Cajon Pass. Although this was well before instrumental recording, testimonials of the shaking and the offsets of small dry creek beds like Wallace Creek indicate that the 1857 earthquake was also a magnitude 7.8. Wallace Creek is an offset dry creek located in the Carrizo Plain where the San Andreas Fault slip rate was estimated.
Of all the really interesting features along the San Andreas Fault, Wallace Creek really stands out as the exemplary place to really understand how the San Andreas Fault works. Just by seeing that site, you can just understand how the fault moves. You can see that earthquake after earthquake, that channel's been offset. And then you can see that it re-incised and was offset some more. It's really hard to imagine how that could be interpreted any other way.
The San Andreas Fault slip rate gives scientists an important idea of how fast it is moving, and how often it may produce big earthquakes. The science of paleoseismology involves deciphering the record of the past earthquakes from reading the disrupted strata along the fault and dating the offset layers using radiocarbon.
One of the things about Wallace Creek to think about is that back in the late 1970s when Kerry C. was working there, he was defining the state-of-the-art in paleoseismology at that time. And since then, a lot of other people have done a lot of other kinds of studies. And through time, the state-of-the-art has changed, and so nowadays when people are doing a fault slip rate study, they might get dozens of radiocarbon samples, and they might do very careful measurements of the offset of the feature using LiDAR or a total station surveying instrument.
New technologies allow SoSAFE scientists to measure offsets such as this one with greater precision. The National Science Foundation funded an airborne LiDAR project led by Mike Beavis called B4. This project involves scanning the entire Southern San Andreas fault system, including the San Jacinto fault in 2005. SoSAFE then supported work by many scientists to take full advantage of this remarkable LiDAR data set.
The other thing that SoSAFE did was it took another look at where we have some evidence for paleoseismic events, but not enough. And so the community in the SoSAFE workshops looked at existing data and looked at where we were missing data. The general approach of the SoSAFE project has really been to take another more careful look at where we have the best geological slip rate estimates for the San Andreas Fault.
We have been working at the Bedard Fan site, located about 3.5 miles or roughly 5 kilometers southeast of the famous Wallace Creek site in the Carrizo Plain. This site is located along a section of the San Andreas Fault which thought to have ruptured only during large magnitude earthquakes which occurred fairly infrequently. By excavating through the fault repeatedly and dating dozens of samples, we have revealed an extraordinarily complex record of the past earthquakes that ruptured this section of the San Andreas Fault. The data suggests that earthquakes happened a lot more frequently than previously thought, but the time intervals between each surface rupture earthquakes also varied. They were not constant. Getting this new set of results gives us a whole new understanding of the complexity of the fault behavior.
We're at the Fraser Mountain Paleoseismic Site, which is about midway along the rupture from the great 1857 Fort Tejon earthquake. And that was the only historic earthquake that ruptured this part of the fault.
We started working here in 2007 after some colleagues had tried to begin trenching here, but right after a big El Nino season came through and the site was extremely wet. We came after a drought and were able to go and see much deeper sediments, the soil and sand horizons that you see here. The reason that the Fraser Mountain site is important is because we're located between the Carrizo Plain and some very well-studied sites in the Mojave section of the San Andreas. And so in order to correlate earthquakes along this very long 200-kilometer stretch of the fault, we needed a site about halfway in between to be able to match events and see how big they were.
Since this is the only historic earthquake that we've documented, at the site we cut trenches to expose older layers to find evidence for older earthquakes.
SoSAFE has been instrumental in getting this site started. We started in 2007 and did 2 separate field sessions out here, and we've come back every year to try and go deeper and deeper and understand the earthquake record.
One of the things that we did in the SoSAFE project was we took the Biskra Palms Oasis site down in the Coachella Valley and we thoroughly reinvestigated it to try to arrive at a better understood estimate of the slip rate on the San Andreas Fault at that location. So we used the LiDAR data to re-estimate the total offset, and then Whitney Bearer used excavations with a track hoe to test some of the hypotheses that were in the Van der Voort et al. Paper, and really arrived at an entirely new geological interpretation of the offset of that alluvial fan complex.
SoSAFE allowed us to explore the use of the B4 LiDAR data to reevaluate geological offsets at the Biskra Palms Oasis site on the southernmost San Andreas Fault. This is the part of the fault that last broke over 300 years ago in a big earthquake in about 1680. And yet on average, the San Andreas is thought to rupture about every 150 years. So on that basis, the Great California Earthquake scenario, the shakeout, started on the Southern San Andreas, and one day it's expected that this section of the fault will again rupture in a big earthquake. The B4 LiDAR data and a suite of large boulder samples were actually collected just prior to massive excavations here that were associated with gravel quarrying, and so now the entire fan is essentially gone. At Biskra, we were also able to make some important corrections and revisions in the offset and ages, and as a result, the San Andreas slip history is much better understood than it was just a few years ago.
The Southern San Andreas is the most active fault near Los Angeles, which is the largest American metropolitan area at serious risk for a major earthquake.
We wanted to address all of these issues and try to improve our understanding of the risk of this major player that poses a risk to 20 million Southern Californians. The goal of SoSAFE is to understand the history of earthquakes on the San Andreas Fault for the last 2 to 3 millennia, and to understand the distribution of the plate motion between the San Andreas and San Jacinto faults.